Under the soft glow of aged ceiling lamps, the small diner at the edge of Pike Place Market carried a kind of quiet chaos. The Seattle rain slicked the streets outside, turning neon signs into blurred watercolor smears against the fogged windows. Inside, the air was thick with the rich scent of coffee and buttered toast, mingling with the faint hiss of the ancient espresso machine that coughed more than it steamed. Plates clinked, forks scraped, and conversations overlapped in a symphony only familiar to those who spent their lives in places like this. Emily Carter moved through it all like someone accustomed to weaving her body through narrow spaces and heavier silences. At 26 she didn't possess the kind of beauty that stopped people, cold not in the traditional sense. Her face held a softness, a quietness that seemed at odds with her posture, straight-backed, shoulders slightly tense as if expecting invisible blows. Her brown hair was pulled into a tidy bun at the nape of her neck, those strands slipped free, framing a face pale from too many early mornings and long nights. But it wasn't her tired eyes or her delicate frame that drew people's stares. It was the scar, running down her left forearm like an unspoken story, jagged and uneven. It caught the dim light and refused to let go of it. There were whispers about it, always whispers. A burn, a fight, a reminder of some tragic mistake. The truth was that Emily never answered, and people's curiosity often grew teeth when denied. She steadied the tray in her hands, balancing a set of chipped ceramic mugs filled with scalding coffee. A laugh sharp and unkind cut across the room. "God, look at her arm," a woman's voice said, just loud enough for Emily to hear as she passed table 6. "I can't even eat looking at that. How do they let her serve food?" Emily's lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. The words were nothing new. She had been hearing them, or some variation, since the scar had formed like a second skin years ago. They always found her those stares, those hushed judgments. But Emily didn't slow. Instead, she turned her head slightly, enough to catch the woman's gaze. "Oh, this," she said lightly, raising her arm just a fraction, as though she'd been asked about an accessory rather than a wound. "Trophy from when I wrestled a mountain lion. Obviously, I lost." There was a ripple of laughter from a nearby table. The woman flushed, fumbling with her spoon. Emily walked on. Humor. It was a shield she'd learned to wield well. But inside, a small knot tightened in her chest. No matter how many times she deflected, the sting never dulled entirely. She reached the counter, setting the tray down with a quiet exhale, and grabbed a rag to wipe her damp palms. That's when the bell above the diner's door chimed. The man who entered didn't fit. Not here, not in this cramped, slightly grimy place. He moved with a stillness that made people notice him without quite knowing why. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal grey suit that looked untouched by the rain. His dark hair was slicked back, in a way that spoke of both precision and ease, and when his eyes swept over the room, deep-set, sharp, assessing, Emily felt them land on her like a physical touch. She looked away quickly, busying herself with refilling the sugar containers. He chose a table by the window, sitting with the quiet confidence of a man used to claiming space. Emily approached, her steps even, the practiced rhythm of someone who had long mastered how to appear unbothered. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice carrying that familiar lilt of polite indifference she gave all strangers. "Black coffee," he said simply. "No sugar." She nodded, scribbling it down, though she already knew she'd remember. She walked back to the counter. She felt it again, that weight of his gaze, not leering, not unkind, but heavy, curious. Emily hated being watched. Behind the counter, she busied herself with the machine, her hands moving automatically. Outside, the rain picked up, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. She glanced at him just once before, forcing her eyes back to the coffee dripping into the pot. There was something about him that unsettled her. Not danger, not exactly, but a sense of being seen too clearly. What she couldn't know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that Lucas Bennett had come into the diner, not for warmth, not for coffee, but for her. She didn't know that he had spent months combing through fragments of a life that had once been hers, that in his breast pocket there was a worn photograph of a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, a woman with golden hair smiling faintly at the camera. She didn't know that he had been sent by a man. She could no longer remember a man whose mistakes had cast shadows long enough to swallow her entire childhood. But Lucas Bennett did know. He knew she was the girl who had disappeared. 2 decades ago, he knew the scar wasn't the only mark fate had left on her skin, and he knew, in the quiet certainty of someone who had spent too many nights haunted by someone else's regrets, that Emily Carter's life was about to change. As Emily set his coffee down in front of him, their eyes met briefly, hers, guarded and tired, his calm and unreadable. "Thanks," he said. "Sure," she replied, the words soft but clipped, and she turned before he could say more. Lucas watched her retreat, noting the way her fingers flexed, as if to shake off tension. The faintest outline of a swallow-shaped birthmark peeked beneath her sleeve when she reached for a mug. His hand tightened around the coffee cup. It was her. There was no longer any doubt, but for Lucas Bennett, finding her had only been the beginning. The harder part, the dangerous part, would be convincing her to let him close enough to tell her the truth. The Seattle rain had a way of clinging to everything, coating windows, sidewalks, even people's hearts in a mist that felt almost permanent. For Emily Carter, it was background noise, no more remarkable than the soft clatter of cups in the diner or the distant hum of passing cars. But tonight, as she stepped out from under the diner's faded awning, the chill seemed sharper, cutting through her thin jacket. She pulled it tighter, her breath curling in the air. Behind her, the neon sign flickered, casting brief flashes of red across the wet pavement. She didn't notice the figure standing just out of the glow's reach, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, his eyes following her steps with a steady, unreadable intensity. Lucas Bennett had been watching her longer than he cared to admit, not in a way that felt invasive to him, but with a quiet, deliberate patience born of years spent solving puzzles more complicated than corporate mergers. Emily wasn't just another puzzle. She was a living, breathing echo of a promise he had made to a man on the edge of despair. He thought of Robert Sinclair, of their last meeting in the private wing of a hospital overlooking Lake Como. Robert's once commanding frame had been reduced to frail angles beneath a thin blanket, his voice rasping with regret. "She has a birthmark," Robert had whispered, his eyes bright with tears that refused to fall. "A swallow on her wrist. She would be 26 now. God, Lucas, you're my last hope. I can't leave this world without knowing if she's alive." Lucas had given his word, but he hadn't expected the search to lead him to a cramped diner in Seattle or to a woman who moved through her shifts with weary grace and an invisible weight pressing on her shoulders. From the shadows across the street, Lucas watched as Emily paused at a crosswalk. A car splashed through a puddle, and she instinctively stepped back, laughing softly to herself, though no one was there to hear. That laugh, it was light, unguarded, like a sunbeam piercing the grey. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if she laughed like her mother had, if she carried pieces of Margaret Sinclair inside her without knowing. Emily turned onto a quieter street, her pace unhurried. She wasn't going home. Lucas knew that much. She passed rows of shuttered storefronts and a mural that had long since faded, until she reached a modest brick building with peeling white paint, the community center. Lucas stayed on the opposite side of the street, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Through the large front window, he watched her enter. Inside, the room was warm and alive with color. Children sat in a circle, crayons and paper scattered across the floor. Emily knelt among them, her jacket discarded, her scar visible as she helped a little girl draw a house. "Like this?" the child asked, her voice small and hopeful. "Exactly like that," Emily replied, her smile soft and genuine. "That's beautiful." She listened as another boy proudly displayed his drawing of a dragon, laughing when he explained, in a rush of words, how the dragon had turned into a hero instead of a villain. Emily's laughter filled the room, rich and unrestrained, and Lucas felt something shift in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be kind, patient, or so fiercely present in the lives of children who, like her once, had no one else. Lucas thought again of Robert, of the photo he had once shown him, Margaret with golden hair and a little girl in her lap, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Lillian Robert had called her. Emily didn't look like that child anymore. Life had etched lines of exhaustion on her face and replaced innocence with quiet resilience. But the birthmark, the faint swallow he had glimpsed at the diner, when she reached for a muggle, no doubt, it was her. Emily Carter was Lillian Sinclair, and she didn't know. Inside the community center, Emily's expression shifted as she stood and moved to a bulletin board, tacking up a new flyer. There was a moment, just a flicker, when her face fell into shadow, her smile fading as her eyes lingered on the notice. Winter coat drive volunteers needed. Lucas saw it. The sadness that curled around her mouth when no one was watching. When Emily finally stepped back out into the night, Lucas followed from a distance. She turned down another street, stopping at a corner store to buy a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. He noted the careful way she counted her coins at the register, the slight slump of her shoulders as she thanked the cashier. This wasn't the life of an heiress. It was survival. Back in his hotel room, Lucas sat at the desk, his laptop open, but forgotten. The night outside pressed in, Seattle's skyline muted beneath a veil of fog. He took out the photograph again. Margaret's gentle smile, Lillian's small hand clutching her mother's sweater. The girl was gone, but the woman she had become was here. Lucas clenched his jaw. He could not simply walk into her life and announce the truth. Not yet. Emily was guarded, cautious, like someone who had learned long ago not to trust too easily. He needed to know more. Who had raised her after the accident? What had her life been like in the years Robert had spent drowning in guilt and searching in vain? Did she even remember the night her world had been shattered on a rain-slick road? Lucas closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. Robert's voice came back to him, hoarse and pleading. Find her, Lucas, but don't destroy her. There would be time for answers. For now, he would watch. He would wait. Emily Carter had been lost to her family for 20 years. Lucas wasn't going to lose her again. The morning air in Seattle carried a weight that felt almost personal, as if the rain had seeped into every corner of the city, curling around windows and pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk. Emily Carter walked briskly down the street, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her thrifted coat. Her brown hair, pulled back hastily, clung to her neck in damp strands. She hated mornings like this morning's, where the grayness of the sky seemed to echo the grayness inside her chest. The diner was quiet when she arrived. Too quiet. The usual pre-rush hum was absent, replaced by a strange stillness that made her stomach tighten. Inside, her manager stood at the counter, arms crossed, face pinched in irritation. "Carter," he barked the moment she stepped through the door. In the back. Now Emily froze. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She could feel it, the judgment, the simmering anger. Something had gone wrong, and somehow it would be her fault. In the cramped office, her manager gestured sharply toward a stack of complaint forms on the desk. "2 customers wrote in about you yesterday. One said you were rude. The other said your appearance was off-putting." Emily's throat went dry. She tried to speak, but the words lodged behind her ribs. The manager didn't wait. "I can't have customers feeling uncomfortable. We're letting you go." It wasn't anger that filled her, not yet. It was a hollow, familiar kind of ache. She swallowed it down, nodded once, and left without arguing. By the time she stepped back onto the rainy street, the ache had sharpened into something harder. She wrapped her arms around herself and began walking, her boots splashing through puddles. She didn't see the dark sedan parked across the street. The man inside, watching her movements with careful, deliberate stillness. Lucas Bennett had been there before sunrise. He'd felt it in his gut that today would bring a shift, though he hadn't expected to watch her world shrink in the span of a 5-minute conversation. He could see it in the slope of her shoulders, the way her steps faltered before regaining their pace. He didn't need to hear the words to know what had been said. Emily didn't go home. Instead, she turned down a narrow side street and entered a small second-hand bookstore. Lucas waited outside, watching through the rain-slicked glass as she wandered between shelves, her fingers grazing the spines of old paperbacks, as though searching for something she couldn't name. When she emerged 20 minutes later with no books in hand, her face was composed, but her eyes carried that same hollow look he'd seen before. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, torn between the instinct to step out and the promise he'd made to himself to wait. She wasn't ready, but he was. The DNA test results had come back the night before, positive 99.9% certainty that Emily Carter was Lillian Sinclair. He'd stared at the report for hours, the black and white text blurring, as his mind raced with possibilities. How would she react? Would she believe him, or would she turn away, rejecting not only the name but the entire past that came with it? Lucas hadn't expected the answer to feel so complicated. He followed her as she boarded a bus, headed for the outskirts of the city. It was nearly empty, the windows streaked with condensation, turning the world outside into smears of grey and green. Emily sat near the back, her hands folded in her lap. When the bus stopped at a modest building with peeling paint and a crooked sign reading Haven House, she stepped off. Lucas watched as she greeted a small boy at the door, ruffling his hair with a tenderness that surprised him. She spent the next few hours helping serve meals, folding donated clothes, kneeling to tie a little girl's loose shoelace. Every gesture was quiet, unassuming. But Lucas could see the pattern now. She didn't just survive. She poured herself into others, perhaps hoping it would mend the parts of her that still felt broken. He remembered Robert's words in the hospital room, spoken with a trembling hand clutching his photograph. "She has a big heart, Lucas, she always did. That's how you'll know it's her." Lucas had known from the moment he saw her soothe a crying child in the diner, from the way she'd answered cruel remarks with humor instead of bitterness. But seeing her here, among these forgotten lives, it became undeniable. When Emily finally left Haven House that evening, she looked lighter somehow, even as the rain returned with a vengeance. Lucas trailed her at a distance until she reached her small apartment building, an aging structure with cracked steps and a flickering hallway light. Inside his car, Lucas rested his forehead against the steering wheel. The urge to act now, to tell her everything, pressed against his ribs like a clenched fist. But Robert's voice echoed again, "Don't destroy her." This wasn't about him. It wasn't about the promise or the guilt or even the relief of having found her. It was about Emily. And right now, she wasn't ready for the storm that would come with the truth. Lucas looked up at her window, where a faint glow told him she was inside, safe for tonight. He didn't know when or how, but he knew one thing for certain. But when the moment came, he would be ready to catch her, no matter how far she fell. The plane descended into northern Italy under a sky streaked with pale gold, the sun breaking free of a veil of grey clouds as if offering a quiet blessing. Below, the waters of Lake Como shimmered like liquid glass, surrounded by ancient villas and narrow winding roads that clung to the hillside. Emily Carter pressed her forehead against the cold plane window, her breath fogging the glass. She still wasn't sure why she had agreed to come. Lucas Bennett sat a few rows behind her, his face impassive as he scanned over documents on his tablet. He had called it an opportunity, a potential consulting role with one of his non-profit partners, but something about the way he had spoken, measured, almost too careful, had set off a flicker of unease in Emily's chest. She didn't trust him, not really, and yet something in his steady gaze the night he offered her the chance had disarmed her just enough to say yes. The car ride from Milan Airport to the Sinclair estate was silent, save for the occasional voice of the GPS. Emily stared out at the passing landscape, sloping vineyards, tiled rooftops, olive trees bent by years of wind. When the car turned onto a long gravel driveway flanked by wrought iron gates, Emily's fingers dug into the seams of her coat. The estate came into view slowly, like a ghost revealing itself. It was vast but weary, its ivy-clad stone walls whispering of a grand past, now dulled with time. Lucas parked in front of the main house and turned to her. "He's expecting us," he said simply. Emily forced her legs to move, stepping out into the crisp air that smelled faintly of rain and roses. She tried to steel herself, tried to bury the growing suspicion that had taken root since the first time she saw Lucas watching her with those sharp, unreadable eyes. Inside, the house was a gallery of memory. High ceilings, portraits of somber ancestors, a sweeping staircase whose banister had been polished smooth by centuries of hands. At the top of the stairs, a door stood slightly ajar. Lucas gestured for her to follow. The room smelled faintly of old wood and lavender. In the corner, a man sat in a large armchair by the window, his frame shrouded in a wool blanket. His skin was pale, drawn tight over the delicate architecture of his bones. His hands, once strong and commanding, now trembled as they rested atop a photograph. Emily froze. Something inside her tightened unbearably. She didn't know this man, and yet a strange wave of recognition swept over her, unbidden and unwelcome. "Emily," Lucas said gently, "this is Robert Sinclair." The man looked up. His eyes, clouded yet strikingly alive, found hers. "Lillian," he whispered. The name cut through her like broken glass. I'm sorry," Emily stammered, stepping back. "I think there's been a mistake." But Robert's face crumpled, and his hands clutched the photograph more tightly. "No mistake," he rasped. "The birthmark, the scar, your eyes, it's you, my daughter." Emily's heart pounded, the sound roaring in her ears. She turned to Lucas, her voice sharp with betrayal. "What is this? Why am I here?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "I didn't bring you here to deceive you. I brought you here because this is your family. Emily, you are Lillian Sinclair. We confirmed it through DNA." Her knees went weak. She stumbled back until her shoulder hit the door frame. "This is insane," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I grew up in foster homes. I don't know these people." Robert struggled to his feet, swaying like a sapling in the wind. "Because I failed you," he said, each word a cracked whisper. "I doubted your mother. I sent her away in anger. And that night, I lost you both." Emily's throat burned. She wanted to run, to shut the door and never look back, but her feet refused to move. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice low. "I don't remember any of this. I don't remember you." "You were 4, Robert said, his face twisted with grief. "How could you? But I've remembered every single day, every birthday, every sleepless night wondering if you were safe." Emily's eyes flicked to Lucas. "And you've been watching me like a hawk. Why? Out of pity? Out of guilt? Or are you just another Sinclair trying to clean up an old mess?" Lucas didn't flinch. "Out of a promise. I swore to your father I'd find you. But I stayed because I saw you. Emmeline, the Sinclair heir, not the missing daughter. You." Emily's chest rose and fell rapidly as she backed toward the door. "I can't do this. I didn't ask for any of this. Emily, please." But she was already gone, the door closing softly behind her. Downstairs, she fled through the grand foyer and out into the garden, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The air smelled of wet stone and roses in bloom, but she couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight pressing against her ribcage. She sank onto a marble bench beneath a flowering archway, burying her face in her hands. She had come here for a job. Instead, she had been handed a history she didn't want, a father she didn't remember, and a truth that felt like a stranger pressing its palm against her heart. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of footsteps on gravel. Emily didn't look up. Lucas stopped a few feet away, his voice quiet. "I know it's too much. I know you feel betrayed. But Emily, he's dying. He just wants a chance to say he's sorry." She lifted her head, her brown eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sorry doesn't give back 20 years, she said hoarsely. "It doesn't give back birthdays or warm beds or someone to hold you when the nightmares come." Lucas's expression softened. "No, it doesn't. But maybe it gives you a chance to decide who you want to be, knowing where you came from." Emily shook her head. "I don't even know if I want to know." And yet, deep down, a quiet voice whispered through the storm of her thoughts, "You've always wanted to know." Emily pressed her palms against her face, willing the tears away. She didn't have answers. She only had questions that felt like they might consume her whole. But she wasn't ready to run. Not yet. A week passed in Lake Como like the stillness before a storm. Emily Carter, Lillian Sinclair by birthright, though she hadn't allowed herself to utter the name aloud, remained on the estate grounds, but at a distance. She wandered the gardens in silence, kept to the east wing of the house, and barely exchanged more than a few civil words with Robert Sinclair. Lucas gave her space, but his presence lingered like a shadow, always near, never imposing. He knew that forcing the truth was not the same as helping her live with it. It was in those quiet days that the world beyond the estate began to stir. The Sinclair family had not been blind to the events unfolding, and unlike Robert, they did not greet Emily's reappearance with joy or reverence. To them, her presence represented disruption, exposure, and most of all, danger. Victoria Sinclair, Robert's cousin and longtime adversary behind polite smiles and carefully measured words, sat at the head of a long walnut table in the library of the estate's secondary villa. Her platinum hair was perfectly pinned, her emerald ring catching the low light as she sipped from a crystal glass of red wine. "A ghost," Victoria said coldly, "dragged in by that American like some twisted fairy tale. We don't even know where she's been these past 20 years, what she's been, but now she's here." And Robert, senile fool that he is, has practically crowned her. Around her, other relatives, nodded, less powerful in title, but eager in ambition. "She inherit everything," a balding uncle muttered. "If he rewrites the will, everything." Victoria's lips curled. "Which is precisely why we won't allow it." She opened a leather folder and slid its contents onto the table. Forged reports, fabricated school records, and a photograph of Emily in a Seattle shelter that had been heavily cropped and captioned to suggest deception. A smear campaign, carefully constructed. "We'll make it look like she planned this," Victoria said, "as if she's been preparing for years, manipulating her way into our lives to steal what isn't hers. She doesn't even know about the inheritance," someone whispered. Victoria leaned forward, voice like ice. "Then she won't see it coming." The next morning, the tabloids erupted. Orphan girl or mastermind? Mysterious heiress claimed Sinclair name. DNA results questioned. Was it all a lie? Who was Emily Carter really? In the grand dining room of the estate, Emily sat frozen as the headlines played across the television screen. Her hand trembled as she turned the volume down, her breath catching in her throat. She had never wanted this. Not the name, not the wealth, certainly not the war. The knock on the door was soft. Lucas entered, a moment later, holding a folded newspaper. In one hand, his jaw tense. "I didn't want you to see it like this," he said. Emily gave a short, bitter laugh. "Is there a good way to be called a fraud in front of the world?" Lucas set the paper down on the table between them. "This is their tactic: pressure. If they can discredit you, they can control the will, the estate, everything." "I don't care about any of that," she snapped, rising to her feet. "I've never asked for a penny. I didn't even want to be here." He watched her carefully. "But you are here." She looked away, anger dissolving into something deeper: wounded disbelief. "I thought I was beginning to understand. I thought maybe I could face it. But this," she gestured to the screen. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Lucas's voice was quieter now. "You're the same woman I met in that diner. The same woman who stood up for herself when the world tried to tear her down. You're not who they say you are, and you never will be." Emily's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears back. "It's not about me anymore, is it? It's about control, power, revenge." "Yes," Lucas said, "but it's also about your story, and whether you let someone else tell it for you." Later that day, Emily stood in the hallway outside Robert's study. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob. After a long pause, she turned it and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, heavy with the scent of old paper and fading lavender. Robert sat in his chair, the photo of Margaret and young Lillian still resting on the table beside him. "You've seen the headlines?" she asked, her voice steady. He nodded slowly. "I have." Emily folded her arms. "Why didn't you tell me how ruthless they were?" "I thought I could shield you," he said. "But I was wrong." She moved closer until she could see the years carved into his face, the deep regrets, the longing, the failing hope. "I don't want your money," she said. "I need you to understand that." "I do," he whispered, "but I can't stay silent either, not anymore." The next day, she stood beside Lucas at a press conference in Milan, the Sinclair name looming over her like a storm cloud. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Emily's voice, when she spoke, was clear. "My name is Emily Carter. I was raised in foster homes, shelters, places no child should ever call home. I didn't know I came from this family. I didn't seek out this name. It found me. And I have nothing to hide." Lucas stepped forward, holding a folder of evidence, DNA confirmations, timelines, and a paper trail tracing the forged documents directly to Victoria. He placed the folder on the podium and said, "This is the truth, and we invite anyone to challenge it." The headlines shifted overnight. Where suspicion once simmered, now came the shock of exposure. Victoria's name surfaced in whispers of fraud. The family, fractured and cornered, began to retreat. Back at the estate, the air felt lighter. Emily walked the gardens again, this time with her head higher. She found Robert on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, his gaze turned toward the lake. "They're quiet," he said with a wry smile, "almost too quiet." Emily sat beside him. "The truth has a way of silencing people." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "You've done more than I ever could. You faced them." "I had help," she replied, glancing toward the path where Lucas had gone minutes earlier. Robert's breath came shallower these days. Each word cost him something. "I won't be here much longer," he said. Emily's hand tightened around the armrest of the chair. "Don't say that. I need you to know something," he continued. "I've changed the will. Everything I have, what's left, is yours." Her eyes widened. "No, I told you, I don't want." "It's not about want," he interrupted, gently. "It's about restoring what I broke, what I threw away in anger and pride. This isn't a reward, it's a return." She didn't speak for a long time, and when she did, her voice trembled. "I'm not sure I can forgive you." "I know," Robert said, his voice no louder than the breeze, "but I'm not sure I want to carry the weight of anger anymore, either." Robert nodded, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, a truce, not sealed in words, but in the fragile threads of understanding. That night, as the stars blinked awake over Lake Como, Emily stood on the balcony of her room. Below her, the estate spread out like a memory too large to hold. She no longer felt like an intruder, but she didn't feel entirely at home either. Somewhere in between, she had found herself, and she wasn't done yet. The air in the Sinclair estate carried a different weight now. It wasn't just the heavy scent of roses in the late spring bloom, or the faint trace of rain lingering from the night before. It was something quieter, almost imperceptible, but Emily felt it pressing on her chest every time she stepped through the long hallways. A stillness had settled over the house since the day Robert had spoken those words. "Everything I have is yours." Emily hadn't answered him then, not with words. Instead, she had walked out to the gardens, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass, and stared across the vast waters of Lake Como until the sunlight bled into darkness. Lucas found her there hours later, her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the warm air. "You've barely eaten today," he said gently. She didn't turn. "I'm not hungry, Emily." The sound of her name in his voice made her close her eyes. She still wasn't used to hearing it from him, how it softened when he said it, how it seemed to carry a weight of its own. "I can't stop thinking," she admitted, "about everything, about the years I spent wondering if I was wanted anywhere, and now this." She exhaled sharply, a humorless laugh escaping her. "Now I'm supposed to believe I belong in a place like this." Lucas didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, careful not to push. "Belonging isn't about marble floors or family crests," he said. "It's about people. The ones who stay, the ones who see you for who you are." Emily looked down at her hands, the faint scar catching the moonlight, the outline of the swallow-shaped birthmark barely visible beneath. "They didn't see me," she whispered. "Not for 20 years. They didn't," Lucas agreed. "But I do." She turned then, meeting his gaze. There it was, again steady, unflinching, and full of something she couldn't name. For a moment, she hated him for it, for seeing too much, for making her feel as if she was made of glass. But mostly, she hated how part of her wanted to let him. The next morning brought a knock on her door. It was Robert's nurse, her face pale. "He's asking for you." Emily hesitated. In the hallway outside his room, her fingers brushing the cool brass doorknob. When she finally entered, Robert was propped up in bed, his breathing labored, the skin beneath his eyes shadowed. "Emily," he rasped, his voice almost too weak to carry. She pulled a chair closer. "You shouldn't strain yourself." "I have to," he said, his fingers trembling as they reached for hers. She let him take her hand, surprised at how fragile it felt, as if the bones beneath the skin might crumble. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Robert whispered, "but if I could ask one thing, it would be that you don't let them win. Don't let them erase you." "I'm not fighting for this family's fortune," she said quietly. "I know." His lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile he could manage. "Fight for yourself, for your mother's memory, for the children like you who are still waiting for someone to tell them they matter." Emily's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump lodged there. When she left the room, Lucas was waiting in the hallway. He didn't ask what Robert had said. He only offered a small, knowing nod. That afternoon, Emily stood in the grand hall before the Sinclair family, who had gathered at Victoria's request. Victoria's voice rang sharp as glass. "Are we truly expected to accept this girl, this stranger, as the face of the Sinclair legacy? She's been here 5 minutes, and already brought scandal to our doorstep." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "I never asked for this legacy, but I won't allow you to drag my name through the mud to protect your own greed." Gasps fluttered through the room. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You think you can stand against us?" Emily straightened her shoulders. "I don't need to stand against you. I'm stepping out of this fight altogether." Whispers spread like wildfire, but Emily's voice cut clean through them. "I don't want the fortune. I don't want the estate. I'm establishing the Margaret Foundation in my mother's name. Every cent I inherit will go to children who grew up like I did, forgotten, abandoned, waiting for someone to believe in them." Victoria's face paled. The others shifted uncomfortably. "You're giving it away?" a relative asked incredulously. Emily's brown eyes shone with quiet resolve. "I'm giving it back, to where it should have gone all along." Later, in the solitude of her room, Emily sat by the window, her legs drawn up, her chin resting on her knees. The storm had passed, but her chest still felt tight, as though the air hadn't fully returned. A soft knock came. Lucas entered without waiting for permission. "You were extraordinary today," he said. Emily gave a small, tired laugh. "I feel like I've been shattered into 1,000 pieces." "Maybe," Lucas said, "but you're putting them back together, and you're not alone." She turned her head, catching the sincerity in his eyes. It scared her more than the threats, more than the whispers of betrayal from the Sinclair family. "I don't know how to let anyone in," she confessed. "You don't have to know," Lucas replied. "You just have to let it happen." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Emily reached out, her fingers grazing his. His hand closed over hers, with a warmth that felt impossibly steady. She didn't know if she could forgive her father entirely. She didn't know if she could ever see herself as a Sinclair. But she knew one thing. She was no longer standing alone. The days that followed Robert Sinclair's final declaration moved with an unsettling stillness, as though time itself had taken a breath. The estate, once humming with footsteps and hushed conversations in its cavernous halls, now felt muted. Even the ever-watchful staff spoke in softer tones, their eyes lingering on closed doors as if waiting for anything to stir. Emily Carter felt that same waiting within her, like a clock ticking faintly in the background of her chest, counting down to a moment she didn't yet understand. Robert's health was failing rapidly. She had known it since the first time she'd seen him in that armchair, pale and diminished. But now the truth pressed harder. The man who had been a looming shadow in her imagination all her life, absent and yet shaping everything, was slipping into silence before her eyes. She sat with him one evening, the lake outside glowing faintly under a waxing moon. Robert's breathing was shallow, each inhale labored. His hand, frail and spotted with age, rested over Emily's. She didn't pull away. She no longer felt the sharp resentment that had once burned in her chest when she thought of him. What she felt now was harder to name, an ache steeped in sorrow, threaded with something dangerously close to tenderness. "I wasn't the father you deserved," Robert whispered. His voice was weak, but the regret carried sharp edges. "I didn't protect your mother. I didn't protect you." Emily swallowed hard, the familiar knot rising in her throat. She had rehearsed a dozen different things she might say if this moment ever came. Words like anger, like finality, but none of them felt right here. "You can't rewrite the past," she said softly, "but maybe you can let go of it." His lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile he could manage. "You sound like your mother." Emily blinked against the sting in her eyes. She had no memory of Margaret Sinclair's voice or face beyond what she'd seen in photographs. And yet, hearing Robert say it, she wanted so badly for it to be true. That night, Robert slipped into unconsciousness and never fully woke again. When the monitors in his room fell silent 2 days later, Emily felt a strange stillness settle over her. It wasn't the wild, tearing grief she expected. It was quieter, heavier, like standing in the eye of a storm. The reading of the will came shortly after, and with it, the firestorm she had feared. Emily sat at one end of the long walnut table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, Victoria Sinclair's expression was carved from ice. "It's absurd," Victoria said sharply when the lawyer read Robert's decision aloud. He was in no state of mind to make changes to the will. "This girl, this stranger, has manipulated him." Emily didn't flinch. She met Victoria's glare with a steady calm that surprised even herself. "I don't want Robert's fortune," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I told him so before he passed." The room fell silent for a moment, as though no one quite believed her. Victoria's lips thinned. "Then why are you here?" "Because I promised him I'd see his legacy used for something that mattered," Emily replied. "I'm creating the Margaret Foundation in my mother's name. It will serve children who grew up like I did. Every cent I inherit goes to that." Gasps rippled through the room. A few of the younger relatives exchanged nervous glances, but Victoria wasn't finished. "You expect us to believe you'd give it all away," she spat. "You're either lying or insane." Emily didn't waver. "I don't care if you believe me. I care about what I do next." Later, in the solitude of her room, Emily let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The weight of the last few days pressed down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her. She wasn't sure she could hold it all. Not the grief, not the hostility, not the responsibility she had just chosen. The knock on her door was gentle. She didn't need to ask who it was. Lucas stepped inside, his eyes finding hers instantly. "You were remarkable in there," he said. Robert would have been proud. Emily managed a faint smile. "I don't feel remarkable. I feel emptied out." He came closer, his voice softening. "That's what courage feels like sometimes. Hollow, heavy, but it's still courage." Emily looked down at her hands, at the faint lines of the scar that no longer seemed like something she had to hide. "I didn't think I'd ever be someone who could stand in front of people like that," she admitted. "But today, I wanted to. Not for Robert, not for the Sinclairs, for me." Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes warm. "For you," he echoed. They stood there in silence for a long time, the only sound, the distant murmur of the lake and the occasional call of a night bird. When Emily finally looked up, she saw in Lucas's face something she had been too afraid to name until now. It wasn't just steadiness, it wasn't just loyalty, it was something deeper, more dangerous, and more life-giving all at once. "You stayed," she said softly. "I did," Lucas replied. "And I will, if you'll let me." Emily's chest tightened. For so long, she had carried her independence like armor. But with Lucas, it didn't feel like surrender to let someone stand beside her. It felt like relief. She reached for his hand before she could talk herself out of it. His fingers curled around hers with a warmth that made her want to cry. "Then stay," she whispered. "But not because I need saving. Stay because you want to." "I do," he said simply. In that moment, Emily didn't feel like a Sinclair. She didn't feel like the orphaned girl with a scar, or the woman the world had tried to brand a fraud. She felt like herself, imperfect, still healing, but finally standing on her own feet. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. The air at Lake Como felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the estate itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Wildflowers had begun to bloom along the edges of the garden paths, their colors soft and defiant against the muted stone of the Sinclair house. Emily Carter found herself walking those paths each morning, the gravel crunching under her shoes, her thoughts as tangled and alive as the vines crawling over the old walls. She no longer felt like a visitor, though she could not say she felt at home either. The Sinclair name still rested on her shoulders like a coat she hadn't quite grown into, but it no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like a responsibility, a choice she had made when she stood before her father's family and declared her intention to transform his wealth into something meaningful. The Margaret Foundation had taken shape faster than she expected. Lawyers and advisors, people she once thought belonged in another universe, now sat in rooms with her, asking her opinion, listening as if her words carried weight. Plans for shelters, education programs, and medical clinics were sketched out on giant sheets of paper, spread across oak tables. It was exhausting and exhilarating. Lucas Bennett had been there through it all, quiet but unmovable. He never tried to take over, never made her feel small in the way men of power so often did. Instead, he stood beside her, reminding her with a glance or a hand at her elbow that she didn't have to carry everything alone. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Emily found herself sitting with Lucas on the stone steps leading down to the lake. The air smelled faintly of jasmine. The sun had set, leaving behind streaks of gold and rose that melted into the water. She hugged her knees to her chest and stared at the rippling surface. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. Lucas turned his head, his profile outlined by the last light of day. "Of what? Of failing, of not being enough to carry this forward. Of," she hesitated, her voice tightening, "of losing myself in all of this." "You won't," he said, his tone so certain it startled her. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen you fight for a place in this world when no one offered you one. You're not here because of Robert or his money. You're here because you chose to stay and make it matter. That's who you are, Emily." She swallowed hard. "I don't even know who I am some days." He shifted closer, his hand brushing against hers. "I do." Emily turned to him then, her chest aching with 1,000 things she couldn't say. She saw the steady warmth in his eyes, the quiet promise he carried in the way he stayed, in the way he never flinched from her scar or her pain. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. Their fingers laced together easily, naturally, like they had always known how to fit. Lucas's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "You don't have to do it all alone anymore. I don't know how to let someone in she admitted, her voice breaking just enough to betray the truth. Then, let me show you, he said. It was not a grand confession, not a sweeping declaration of love, but it settled deep in her chest all the same, warming the coldest parts of her. Months passed in a blur of planning and progress. The first Margaret Foundation shelter opened in Milan. A renovated villa turned into a haven for children. Emily cut the ribbon herself, her hands trembling slightly as she did, though her voice was steady when she spoke to the gathered crowd. This isn't about charity, she said. It's about giving every child the chance to feel safe, to feel wanted, to feel seen, because I know what it's like to grow up without those things, and no child should ever have to. There was applause, but Emily barely heard it. Her eyes had found Lucas's in the crowd, and his quiet, proud smile was all the reassurance she needed. That night, back at the estate, Emily wandered into the old library. The room smelled faintly of aged leather and lavender. She ran her fingers along the spines of books she doubted anyone had touched in decades, until she came to a stop before the grand window overlooking the gardens. Lucas found her there, leaning against the frame, the moonlight pooling around her like liquid silver. Couldn't sleep, he asked. She shook her head. Too much in my head. Want to share some of it? She turned to face him, her expression soft but weary. I'm realizing how much of my life I've spent bracing for disappointment. Even now, part of me is waiting for the other shoe to drop. For all of this, she gestured vaguely around them, to be taken away somehow. Lucas stepped closer. Emily, you've built something no one can take from you. Not the Sinclairs, not the tabloids, not the past. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to hold the weight alone. You've been here for all of it, she said quietly. And I will be, he answered. The words sank deep into her, anchoring her in a way nothing else had. Lucas, she whispered, I don't know where this leads. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. Then let's find out together. Emily closed her eyes as his thumb brushed against her skin. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't rushed or demanding. It was careful, reverent, as if he knew he was stepping across a threshold she had guarded all her life. She didn't pull away. When they parted, the world felt quieter, as though even the restless ghosts of the house had stilled to witness them. Emily let out a shaky breath. I've been so afraid of needing someone. Needing someone isn't weakness, Lucas said. It's proof you're still human. She smiled faintly, resting her forehead against his. Then maybe I'm ready to be human again. For the first time, she believed it. The first anniversary of the Margaret Foundation dawned with a brilliance that seemed almost intentional, as if the universe itself was celebrating. Sunlight spilled over the estate gardens, painting the manicured hedges and blooming wildflowers in shades of gold. White tents dotted the expansive lawn, their edges fluttering gently in the warm breeze. Children darted between them, laughter ringing out like wind chimes as they chased balloons and played games. Emily Carter stood at the center of it all, a pale blue dress falling softly over her frame, her brown hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't hide the scar on her arm anymore. It caught the light as she bent to tie a little boy's shoelace, his face alight with the kind of carefree joy she once thought only belonged to other people's childhoods. She looked up to see Lucas Bennett standing nearby, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored slacks. His dark eyes tracked her every move, not with the watchfulness of a guardian anymore, but with something gentler, quiet pride that radiated from him, even when he said nothing. It had been a year of building and breaking and building again. The Margaret Foundation now had shelters in 3 countries, with more on the way. Hundreds of children had found homes, and countless others had found safety, education, and hope. The headlines that had once branded Emily a fraud now celebrated her as a visionary, a woman who had turned her pain into light for others. But Emily didn't measure her success in articles or accolades. She measured it in the smile of a little girl clutching a new backpack, in the way a teenager's shoulders straightened when someone finally believed in his future, in the sense of peace that settled in her own chest when she looked at all they had created. Later that afternoon, when most of the guests had drifted toward the food tables and children's games, Emily slipped into the quiet of the small garden. Behind the main tent, she needed a moment to breathe. Lucas followed her a few minutes later, his footsteps slow on the stone path. She turned at the sound, her lips curving in a smile that reached her eyes. You're escaping too, she teased softly. Maybe, he said, or maybe I was looking for you. Emily looked down, her fingers brushing the edge of a blooming rose. It still feels strange, sometimes, being here, being her Lillian Sinclair, she said, the name still tasting unfamiliar. This foundation, this life, it's so different from what I ever imagined for myself. Lucas stepped closer until there was only a breath of space between them. But isn't that the point? You didn't imagine it because you were too busy surviving. Now you're living. Emily's throat tightened. I couldn't have done it alone. You didn't have to. There was a silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was full, warm, like the pause between two notes of a song that belonged together. Lucas reached into his jacket pocket, and Emily's brow furrowed slightly as he drew out a small, worn box. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the flicker of nerves beneath. "This last year, I've watched you rebuild your world from ashes. I've watched you give and fight and grow, and I've fallen in love with you not because of what you've overcome, but because of who you are when the world isn't watching." He opened a box to reveal a simple silver ring, its band delicately engraved with a swallow in flight. "I don't want to save you, and I don't want to hold you back. I just want to stand with you. For every new beginning, every quiet moment, every storm." Emily felt her breath catch as tears filled her eyes. "You're not asking for easy," she whispered. "I'm asking for real," Lucas said. "For as long as you'll have me." Emily looked down at the ring, then back at him. The scar on her arm caught the sunlight as she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling only slightly. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Lucas." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it settled, not just over skin, but over years of hurt and healing, over the mark of her past and the promise of her future. They stood there in the fading light, their foreheads pressed together, laughter and music drifting faintly from the celebration behind them. Months later, their wedding was held in that same garden where the foundation's anniversary had been celebrated. There were no grand displays, no towering floral arrangements, no gilded invitations sent to impress the elite. There were only the children of the Margaret Foundation tossing petals into the air, their laughter mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet. Emily walked down the aisle in a simple ivory dress, her brown hair loose, her scar visible and unhidden. She didn't feel the weight of a past she had once feared would define her. She felt only the lightness of a heart finally, free to love, to forgive, to belong. Lucas stood, waiting at the end of the aisle, his smile breaking wide when he saw her. When they spoke their vows, it wasn't just a union of two people, but a testament to every broken piece they had pieced together. Every night of fear turned into mornings of hope. "I didn't believe in destiny before you," Emily said through tears. "Now I believe in us." And when Lucas answered, his voice was steady, unshaken. "I'll love you in every version of this life, whether you are Emily or Lillian or both. I'll love all of you." As they kissed, the children erupted into cheers, tossing handfuls of wildflowers that rained down like stars on the grass. That night, under the glow of lanterns and a sky blooming with constellations, Emily sat hand in hand with Lucas, watching the children play. "I don't feel like I'm carrying the past anymore," she whispered. "You're not," Lucas said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You're carrying the future now." And as the laughter and music rose around them, Emily Carter Lillian Sinclair finally let herself believe it. She wasn't just surviving, she was home. The Margaret Foundation's second anniversary was approaching, and Emily Carter could feel the excitement pulsing through every corner of the Sinclair estate. Plans were underway for a grand gala to celebrate not only the milestones achieved, but also the lives touched by the work she and her team had poured themselves into. The halls echoed with laughter, the scent of fresh flowers drifted through open windows, and even the long-forgotten rooms of the estate had been given new life. But beneath it all, Emily sensed a quiet unease. It began with an envelope, a simple, unmarked envelope left on the steps of her office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in clean, clinical font. "Do you really think a name change and a foundation can erase what happened? We haven't forgotten, neither should you." No signature, no return address. Emily's breath hitched as she read it again and again, the words twisting tighter around her ribs with each pass. She had faced skepticism, tabloid scandals, and even family betrayal before, but this felt different. It felt personal. Lucas Bennett noticed her quietness that evening as they shared dinner on the terrace. "You've barely touched your food," he said gently. Emily pushed the plate aside and tried for a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just tired. There's so much to do before the gala. But Lucas's sharp gaze lingered on her. He'd learned long ago how to read the subtleties in her expression. He didn't press her not yet, but he made a silent note to keep her closer. Watch. 2 nights later, the situation escalated. Emily woke to the acrid smell of smoke. At first, she thought it was a dream, but the faint crackling sound confirmed the nightmare. She bolted upright, her heart pounding as she rushed to the window. A thin stream of black smoke rose from the west wing of the estate. "Lucas," she shouted, already running barefoot through the hall. He met her at the staircase, pulling on a shirt, his phone pressed to his ear. "The staff are evacuating. I've called the fire department. Stay close to me." But Emily's mind was spinning. The West Wing, that's where the archives were, rooms filled with records of the Margaret Foundation, Robert Sinclair's journals, and files of every child the organization had helped so far. "They're targeting us," she whispered, horror dawning in her voice. "Emily, don't," Lucas warned, grabbing her wrist as she tried to veer toward the smoke, but she pulled free. "I have to save those files. If we lose them, everything we've built." "Emily," she was already sprinting down the hall, her feet slapping against cold marble, the smell of smoke growing stronger with every step. Inside the archive room, heat pressed against her skin like an invisible hand. She wrapped a scarf around her mouth and nose, her eyes watering as she frantically grabbed boxes of documents and placed them on a rolling cart. Lucas appeared moments later, his face set in grim determination. Together, they pushed the cart out just as flames licked across the far wall, devouring shelves of old photographs. By the time the fire department contained the blaze, a third of the archives were gone. Emily stood in the courtyard, her nightgown stained with soot, her hands trembling. The fire chief approached. "It looks deliberate. Accelerants were found. I suggest increased security." Emily nodded numbly, but her mind was already spinning with questions. Who would do this? Victoria Sinclair had been silenced long ago, after her failed attempt to discredit Emily. Could it be someone from Robert's past? Or worse, someone within the foundation itself? The days that followed were a blur of investigations and meetings with her legal team. Emily pushed herself harder than ever, determined not to let fear undo what they'd built. But late at night, when the house was still, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Lucas's arm around her, and wondered if she had underestimated the lengths people would go to destroy her. Then came the second envelope. It arrived during a board meeting, slipped under the door. This time, the message was even shorter. "You don't deserve this life. Leave, or we'll take it all from you." Lucas's face darkened as he read it over her shoulder. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. This is a threat." Emily set her jaw, her voice steady despite the fear coiled tight in her chest. "I'm not running. If they want to fight, they'll get one." The gala arrived under a veil of heightened security. Guests in glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos sipped champagne, oblivious to the plainclothes guards stationed at every entrance. Emily moved among them with poise, but inside her heart thundered like a drum. She took the stage to speak, her voice carrying across the grand hall. This foundation was born from pain, from loss, but also from love. Love for those still waiting, for someone to see them, someone to believe in them. "We won't let fear or hate undo what we've built. Not ever." Applause thundered, echoing off marble walls. But as Emily stepped down from the stage, she caught sight of a man at the far edge of the crowd, dark-haired, his face obscured. He was gone before she could take another look. Later that night, as fireworks burst over the lake, Emily stood on the balcony with Lucas. "They're not done," she murmured. "No," he said, his hand covering hers. "But neither are we." And for the first time in weeks, Emily smiled, not because the danger had passed, but because she finally felt ready to face it. The story isn't over. To see what happens next in Emily and Lucas's fight for their future, and how the truth behind the threats unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to create more heartfelt, powerful stories like this one. Stay tuned for the next chapter. You won't want to miss the twists ahead.